Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of ISO 45001. We'll be going through an overview of the standard this morning for anyone who is preparing to migrate to the new standard from OSAS 18001-2007 to ISO 45001, or for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time to one of the health and safety standards, which would now be ISO 45001. My name is Austin Matthews. I am the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. Welcome. I have a brief agenda on the screen here to give you an idea of what we'll be covering this morning. We will talk briefly about PJR and who we are, what we do. We will also cover the benefits and drivers of certification. We will cover some information about the migration and the timeline for migrating. Then we'll cover the key changes at a high level for the ISO 45001 standard, followed by a more detailed clause-by-clause overview of the main changes. There are a couple related documents that coincide with ISO 45001's publication or release, and we will talk about those as well towards the end of the presentation. And to conclude the presentation, before we get to questions, we will highlight or summarize the certification process for anyone who, like I said, is pursuing certification for the first time rather than migrating from one health and safety standard to another. And we'll close with questions. So at any point during the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to type those in to the chat box or the question field, and we will save those for the end. I also just quickly want to note that today's presentation, both a recording of the webinar and the slides themselves, will be available after the presentation on PJR's website for anyone who is interested in obtaining a copy. So PJR is one of the leading registrars in the world, and I have a not an all-inclusive list, but a list of countries where we have certified companies, just to give you an idea of the countries represented, certifications offered around the world in a variety of standards. PJR is accredited to grant certification for a wide variety of standards, including the health and safety standard. And this slide actually might be outdated. I apologize. When I created this, we were still in the process of obtaining accreditation for ISO 45001, and I will check on the status of that. We are able to conduct audits to ISO 45001, I know, and we are well into the process of obtaining ISO 45001 accreditation if we have not already done so by the date of today's webinar. And like I said, I will check on that and update the slides if this is outdated. Excuse me. So for health and safety standards such as ISO 45001, some of the benefits of getting certified include a framework for meeting legal requirements, obviously working to improve the organization's health and safety performance, providing a safe environment to do business. There are benefits or improvements around management commitment as well as employee engagement. There are business management benefits, including meeting stakeholder requirements, improving public image, working towards achieving strategic objectives that the organization or the organization's corporate entity might have, the ability to integrate the health and safety management system with other business management systems or other standards as well. There can be improvements for supplier health and safety performance. Maintaining certifications that you can advertise can provide a competitive advantage. Going hand in hand with improving the health and safety performance at the organization, you can also minimize the risk of production delays. There can be other financial benefits in addition to improving public image and providing a competitive advantage. Sometimes with health and safety standards, there may be cost savings with insurance liability premiums. The ISO 45001 standard specifically represents a commitment to occupational health and safety, as well as prevention of injuries and ill health. That's really the core of the standard, the scope of the standard, what the standard represents. As we mentioned on the last slide, reduction of risks and hazards for employees, contractors, visitors, etc., just providing a safe place to work. We already discussed the business management drivers, improving public image, and having a framework for meeting regulatory requirements as well as customer requirements as well. So for anyone who is not already familiar with ISO 45001 2018, this standard is replacing the previous health and safety standard that was in place, which was OSAS 18001 2007. These standards are different. ISO 45001 is an ISO standard, so we would not utilize the term transition. You're not transitioning from one revision of the same standard to the next. You are migrating from one health and safety standard to another. But OSAS 18001 2007 will not be available anymore. So ISO 45001 2018 will be the available health and safety standard option for the Occupational Health and Safety Management System, which we abbreviate OHSMS throughout the presentation, and the requirements for that are defined within the standard. The standard provides a framework for an organization to control its hazards, reduce the risk of accidents, injuries, ill health, and/or downtime, and continually improve its processes and operations. ISO 45001 2018 was published in March of 2018, so almost 2 years ago now. And this is a voluntary certification. You may have suppliers who want to work with companies who have this certification, but it is not a regulatory requirement or an OSAS requirement, or an OSHA requirement to maintain ISO 45001 certification. It is voluntary. So from the date of publication, there is a 3-year migration period for clients who are certified to OSAS 18001 2007. So when the standard was published, existing OSAS 18001 2007 certificates were revised to reflect that expiration date if they were set to expire after that 3-year migration period, and new certificates issued subsequent to the publication of ISO 45001 reflected this expiration date as well. Some of this is quite a bit ago, since again the standard has been released for almost 2 years already, but I still have the slides up for anyone who is playing catch up or wants to learn a bit more. So PGR had issued a transition plan, and I have a link here to communicate deadlines to existing clients. And if you haven't already migrated, we recommend migrating this year during your regularly scheduled audit to make sure you don't have a lapse in certification. Not only do we need to complete the migration audit, but we also have to close the package and issue the certificate before that deadline, before your certificate expires. So we need to make sure we leave enough time for all the other activities that go into that process subsequent to completing the actual audit. If there are any nonconformities, they need to be addressed. The responses and any objective evidence need to be accepted by the auditor, and then PGR has to go through their certification review and decision-making activities, where we review the package, We review the certificate drafts, we issue them to the client for approval, and then issue the formal certificates, all before that expiration date. So keep that in mind. Take a look at your OSAS 18001 certificate, the expiration date. If you have any questions about the timing of your audits, if you haven't migrated already, feel free to contact your scheduler and they can assist you with that. Migration audits can occur during surveillance or recertification audits based on your preference, but please note that at least one day will be added to the audit for the verification of transition requirements. And this is not a PGR requirement. This comes from the transition requirements for the standard itself. I put this information into a timeline in case the visual representation is easier for anyone. And there was a slight change in the deadline. I think they gave a little bit of an extension if memory serves, but so you can take a look at this. We are already auditing to ISO 45001. In June of this year, we will stop auditing to OSAS 18001 altogether. So at the end of 2019 calendar year, we stopped offering new registrations, so no stage 1 audits to OSAS 18001 for new clients. And then in this coming June, we will no longer be auditing to OSAS 18001 at all. So certainly if your surveillance audit or your 2020 audit takes place after June 1st, you'll be automatically migrating anyway, so that we can close out the package and not have a lapse in certification. Everyone needs to migrate before December 1st. So like I said, this is your year to migrate if you have not already done so. Okay, so we will talk a bit about the standard itself, being that this ISO 45001 standard is now an ISO standard. You'll see it reflects the same structure, the Annex SL structure that all the revised ISO standards have adopted. ISO 9001 2015 and ISO 14001 2015, for anyone who is familiar with those standards, reflects the same structure as well. So there are some common terms, some common terminology that you'll see across those standards to make them easier to integrate for anyone who has integrated management systems. And you'll also see the clauses or the section names are the same. So it follows the same format and uses a lot of the same terms. This is the Plan, Do, Check, Act model from ISO 45001. Okay, so for anyone who is familiar with OSAS 18001 or was already certified to the standard, we'll look at the key changes between OSAS 18001 and ISO 45001. Obviously, as we mentioned on the last couple slides, one of the key changes is the adoption of that new ISO structure, that Annex SL structure. So changing the names of the clauses, changing some terms, that is a key change in line with the other ISO standards to make them easier to integrate. In ISO 45001, there is a definite emphasis on leadership, accountability, involvement, knowledge of the system, and we will talk more about these key changes as we go through the presentation. There's a focus on risk management, an emphasis on objectives, measurement, and change, some changes to the communication and awareness requirements within the standard, and overall, the standard is less prescriptive than OSAS 18001. I am not going to go through the terms. I've left them in the slides for anyone who wants to reference them, and obviously they are within the standard. I do just want to note within the definition of the OHSMS, the Occupational Health and Safety Management System, The intended outcomes of the system is really important. And you will hear intended outcomes throughout the presentation. And I mentioned earlier that the point of this standard, the heart of it, is preventing injuries and ill health for workers and providing a safe and healthy workplace. So when we say the intended outcomes, are they meeting the intended outcomes? This is what we're talking about. So you may want to familiarize yourself with this definition or reference it, excuse me, wherever you see that term. Top management is defined within the standard. As I said, this is one of the key changes. Management is really emphasized, so it's important to know who that term is meant to include in your organization. So these can be reviewed on your own if you're interested. They're in the slides. Did I go too far? No, okay. So looking in more detail, some of the changes of ISO 45001, there is an increased prominence of occupational health and safety management within the organization's strategic planning process. There are changes around leadership, as I mentioned, to put the accountability on that leadership team, not just one management representative who's ultimately responsible for everything, and leadership may or may not be aware of resource needs or the amount of work it takes to maintain the system, what needs to be improved upon, how the audits are going, all that kind of stuff. So leadership actually has its own clause in the ISO structure now to emphasize the importance of leadership, identify those roles and responsibilities, and how leadership is ultimately to be promoting the management system from the inside out, or from top to bottom, however you want to look at that. I think one of the main changes in the standard is the tone of proactivity. So you'll see this multiple times throughout the presentation. I'll probably sound like a broken record by the end of the presentation, but ISO 45001 really calls for a greater level of proactivity to whether it's the planning process, identifying the risks, having proactive measures in place, management of change. So we'll talk more about this as the presentation goes on, but essentially these proactive initiatives to protect the health and safety of workers and interested parties, consistent with the context of the organization. And this can include a whole variety of things: hazard identification, risk assessment process, emergency controls, operational controls, monitoring and measurement. And those are just a couple of examples. That's not even an all-inclusive list. Really calling for more proactivity than the previous versions of the standard. There's also a shift from previous versions of the standard to compared to ISO 45001 in terms of what is supposed to be improved upon when we're talking about continual improvement. So this shift, excuse me, getting over a cold. This shift is from an emphasis on improving the system, which is what we used to focus on in previous versions of the standard. Now we'll be focusing on improving the health and safety performance. So that may not mean too much. Hopefully that's clear by the end of the presentation, but looking for improvement, continual improvement to focus on the health and safety performance of the organization versus just the management system itself. There are changes around the communication requirements. Both external and internal communications have been added in equal emphasis in this version of the standard. So keep that in mind when you're developing your communication strategies. There are changes to the documentation requirements. including a term of documented information. So for anyone who has already been through the other ISO standard changes, you're probably familiar with this already, but for anyone who is new to ISO 45001, documented information is a term that now represents both documents and records to allow for a greater level of flexibility. The organizations get to determine what procedures are needed for their processes to be effective or for their process controls, and how they're going to maintain them, or what form of media makes the most sense. So this term is really supposed to be less prescriptive, more inclusive, more flexible for the organizations to determine what makes sense for them. Okay, so we will look at the clauses themselves. We won't necessarily cover every clause in the standard because some things didn't change significantly. So it may seem like we're skipping some stuff, but starting with the beginning, clause 4, focusing on the context of the organization. It's important to determine what the context is, understand what the context is as a framework for the rest of the standard. So you're required by this section of the standard to determine both internal and external issues that are relevant to the occupational health and safety management system and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. So as we mentioned before when we were going through the terms, the concept of the intended outcomes is really important here. So again, go back and reference that definition, familiarize yourself if you're not already familiar with that term, because a lot of this comes down to whether or not the controls or the framework can effectively meet the intended outcomes. And that's what we as auditors are going to be looking for as well. Once you have determined the internal and external issues that are relevant to the management system, you also will go on to determine who the interested parties are, again, as relevant to the management system and its ability to achieve its intended outcomes. And we're not just talking about employees when we talk about interested parties, so that might be a term that you familiarize yourself with as well. And then once you've determined who the interested parties are, you also need to identify what their needs and expectations are, if they have any, and which of those translate to requirements of the management system. So which of those needs and expectations need to be factored in to the management system. Then you will go on to determine the scope of the management system, taking into consideration those internal and external issues that you've identified, as well as those interested party needs and expectations that you have identified. Clause 5 focuses on both leadership and worker participation. So here's where we see the leadership commitment come into play. Top management, go back and look at that definition if you're not sure how that applies to your organization, needs to take on more responsibility for the effectiveness of the management system, how it's integrated with other business practices or processes, whether adequate resources have been provided, and communicating the importance of the management system or the requirements or the necessity to conform to the requirements of the management system. So that's a whole lot for leadership to be ultimately accountable for and responsible for a greater level of accountability. The occupational health and safety policy and objectives both need to be aligned with the strategic direction of the organization and aligned to help achieve the intended outcomes. So there's that term again that we talked about before. One change to the requirements of what needs to be included in the policy is a commitment to participation. So that specific line item was not included before. Otherwise, the contents of the policy are not really any different than ISO OSAS 18001. A management representative is no longer explicitly mentioned anywhere in the standard. So What is required is that top management ensures adequate responsibilities and authorities are assigned, and those responsibilities can be delegated. It doesn't have to be that top management is responsible for everything on paper, but ultimately top management is accountable for the occupational health and safety management system. So even if top management delegates all of those responsibilities, they are still ultimately held accountable for the effectiveness of the system, whether the intended outcomes are being met, and all that good stuff. 5.4 focuses on participation and consultation of workers. These requirements are not new to ISO 45001. They were in OSAS 18001 as well, more or less. And you can take a look at those terms if you're not familiar with participation or consultation. The criteria for these are more specific, though, in ISO 45001. So it's not new, it's not a new concept, but there is more prescriptive criteria in this version of the standard, including identifying the methods of participation and consultation, training requirements, resource needs, etc., identifying and removing obstacles to participation, or at least minimizing those barriers if they cannot be removed, emphasizing non-manager participation and consultation is important as well, getting employees involved in the identification of hazards and risk, operational controls, incident investigation, sometimes even the needs and expectations of interested parties, they can help determine those, determining the monitoring and measurement requirements. Those are just a couple examples of areas where participation and consultation can be important. Clause 6 focuses on planning, and this section has really been restructured compared to previous versions of the standard. Planning and risk determination need to take into consideration both positive and negative, also known as risks and opportunities, respectively, identified issues, and the needs and expectations of interested parties. And the risks and opportunities will be familiar terms to anyone who, for example, has already migrated or transitioned to ISO 14001-2015. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, especially in this planning clause, you will see a focus on achieving the intended outcomes of the occupational health and safety management system. So that's really an important term. So the actions to address risks and opportunities need to be determined in order to ensure that the intended outcomes can be achieved, to prevent or minimize undesired effects, which would be injuries and ill health, which is going back to that heart of the standard, the point of ISO 45001, and to continually improve the performance of the system. Risks and opportunities may be related to occupational health and safety hazards, legal or other requirements, risks and opportunities that can affect the achievement of intended outcomes. So a lot of this is as relevant to the management system's ability to achieve its intended outcomes. Hazard identification is required to be proactive. So this is an area where that call for proactivity is very clear. This section is a bit more prescriptive as well. There are items specifically to be considered when going through this hazard identification process. Some examples include people in the nearby area who can be affected by the organization, people who are at the workplace but not necessarily controlled by the organization, the work area itself and equipment design, actual or proposed changes that would affect the occupational health and safety management system. Past incidents can give you an idea of areas where controls might be lacking. Those are just a couple examples. The more common items to overlook. There needs to be a process to assess the risks, including those relevant to identifying hazards and existing controls with established and proactive criteria. And documented information needs to be retained as evidence. So you can go back to that documented information definition in the standard, and you really get to decide what makes sense for your organization. We need to, as auditors, we need to have some type of evidence that we can review, some output of the process to determine its effectiveness, but what exactly that looks like is up to the organization. Similarly, the expectations would be the same for opportunities. So we talked about risks and opportunities, looking at the positive and the negative. So we also need a process to assess the opportunities relevant to the health and safety performance. These really go hand in hand, these two subclauses. Regarding legal and other requirements, there's a need to keep this information up to date. So not only do you need to determine what's applicable, you also need to maintain that as current information and have ready accessibility to the requirements that are applicable to the organization, to the management system. It's important to determine how those requirements apply to the organization and to the organization's hazards and risks. It's not enough to create a list of regulations that apply. You need to go through the process of determining what those requirements mean, how they apply to your organization, so that you can implement the necessary controls to make sure the OHSMS meets those requirements. Otherwise, a list doesn't do you very much good. Going hand in hand with determining how the requirements apply, you would also determine any communication requirements. Sometimes regulations, permits, different customer requirements or supplier requirements will have communication requirements embedded within them. The need to report X, Y, and Z, sometimes even within a certain time period. It would again be important to determine what those requirements are so that the necessary operational controls can be put in place to meet them. It's important to note here that legal and other requirements can also result in risks or opportunities, or can turn into, or can represent risks or opportunities for the system. In terms of planning action, you need to address any risks, opportunities, legal and other requirements, emergency situations, integration into the management system, and evaluation of effectiveness. The evaluation of effectiveness is often overlooked, and that's an important one to note as well. Planning action also needs to take into account the hierarchy of controls, which can be found in clause 8.1.2, and the system outputs. The hierarchy of controls is not any different than in OSAS 18001. The hierarchy itself has not changed. Occupational health and safety objectives are still required to improve the management system and the performance of the management system. And as I mentioned before, in terms of continual improvement, the emphasis is more on performance of the system than improving the management system itself. This isn't very different from previous versions of the standard. It needs to be consistent with the policy, take into account legal and other requirements, now risks and opportunities as well, and participation and consultation results. It needs to be monitored, if possible, also measured, be communicated as relevant and updated as relevant as well. No significant changes there. However, the planning of the objectives needs to be clearly documented or maintained with documented information to show that you've determined all of these items. And this was not as clear in previous versions of the standard. So you need to take a look at this list, take a look at section 6.2.2 of the standard, and make sure your documented information clearly reflects in some way, shape, or form that your organization has determined all of these elements for how you're going to achieve those objectives. Okay, Clause 7 focuses on support. As I mentioned, there are changes to the competency and awareness requirements. These two have been separated into separate clauses or subclauses, and there are additional requirements for each. The awareness criteria in particular is substantially more prescriptive than in previous versions of the standard or in OSAS 18001. In terms of communication, it's also important to give a greater level of consideration to the commitments that the organization has through its management system to occupational health and safety protection. There may be communication requirements associated with representation, external representation, and reporting. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes your legal and other requirements will include communication requirements. So this is where this needs to be taken into consideration as well. We already touched on the changes for documented information, so you'll find those details in Clause 7 as well. And as I mentioned, that's partly to take into account the modern changes for all the different types of media that are available for organizations to use. There may be less paperwork than in previous versions of the standard, as long as they're effectively meeting the intended outcomes and the requirements of the standard and can show that evidence or those outputs. There's a greater level of flexibility in terms of documented information. And 7.2 houses the competency requirements for workers that can affect the performance of the health and safety management system, and competence must be evidenced through documented information. So like I said before, you need to have that evidence in some form so that it can be audited, it can be verified, but you have some flexibility there. The organization must take action as necessary to ensure the competency requirements that you've determined are necessary have been met, and evaluate effectiveness of actions taken. So I mentioned earlier that the evaluation of effectiveness is often overlooked. This is an important part, especially in terms of competency. The awareness section identifies specific items workers must be made aware of by the organization, and this includes the real or potential ramifications of deviating from the management system requirements. This goes hand in hand with the call for a greater level of proactivity as well. There's no significant changes to the internal communication requirements. I didn't feel the need to include that here. In terms of external communication, which again, these two have now been separated into different subclauses, the internal and external information and communication requirements need to be determined, and not just what needs to be communicated, but how they need to be communicated, if there's a time requirement, if there's a specific person that needs to be contacted, or if there's a specific contact person for your organization. You can determine all of those things to show that you've gone through this process. External interested party views, when relevant, are also to be considered here. So this goes back to the beginning of the standard when we're looking at the needs and expectations of interested parties and how those translate to, in some cases, requirements of the management system. I'm not going to go through the documented information section again, but this is specifically in 7.5. Clause 8 focuses on operations, the operation planning and control for the organization. It's important to have established process criteria with sufficient documented information maintained to ensure process criteria were met. I've mentioned this a couple times already. As I mentioned, there's no changes to the hierarchy of control, or nothing significant anyway. It can be found in 8.1.2. 8.1.3, however, is a new section, management of change. This is very clearly included in ISO 45001. This is a huge part of the proactive expectations for ISO 45001. That was not nearly as clear in OSAS 18001. The need to have a process for controlling planned changes that could affect the occupational health and safety performance of the organization, as well as review and mitigate any negative impacts of inadvertent changes. So some examples of when you might use this process, this management of change process for planning the changes out, might be before new products are introduced, or new services or new processes, before working conditions are changed, before equipment is swapped out or removed, upon identification of any changes to legal and other requirements. Those are just a couple examples. The whole point of the management of change process is to be, again, proactive in your risk assessment, in your hazard identification, that you are reviewing all of that before the change is made, before a change that could impact the occupational health and safety performance, rather than retroactively reviewing the changes that have already been made, or worse, dealing with the injury, the incident investigation process to look back and see what the change caused that wasn't premeditated or reviewed in advance. So you're taking a look at the change that is proposed or planned and assessing the health and safety ramifications or changes to the management system before you go ahead and implement that change, before you introduce a new piece of equipment, before you change the PPE that's supplied to the employees, before you introduce a new chemical to the facility. Uh, 8.1 goes on to cover procurement requirements, contractor requirements, external providers. So specific to procurement, there are processes and controls required for outsourcing of processes to the extent that they could affect the health and safety system or the health and safety performance. The contractor subsection requires identification and control of risks related to the activities that the contractors are going to be performing, or on the other hand, the potential impact of your organization's processes or workers on the contractors themselves. So that goes both ways. If they're on site doing work for the organization, how can they impact the organization and their health and safety performance, their workers, and how can the organization's processes or workers affect the contractors? There's also in this section prescribed criteria for contractor selection, or the need to identify the contractor selection criteria that the organization has, as well as processes to ensure contractor activities meet the requirements of the health and safety management system. So they have to be held accountable. There has to be a process for ensuring that even when the work is outsourced, even when contractors are brought on site, the management system requirements are still being met and performance isn't being negatively affected. Whenever materials or services are outsourced or procured, there need to be controls identified as relevant, again, to the health and safety management system requirements and its ability to meet its intended outcomes. Emergency response requirements are not significantly changed. There are a couple items that have been added to be considered or included in the emergency response process or plan. And these would include the need to review and revise, if needed, any procedures after drills or emergency occurrences, to include any relevant training, including first aid, and to include or consider the needs and capabilities of any relevant interested parties that might be involved. So if they're on site, if they are in the near vicinity, how might they be impacted? and what might their needs be. Clause 5 focuses on performance evaluation. Monitoring and measuring of the system requires that any monitoring or measurement requirements be determined. And again, we're talking not just what is being monitored, but how is it being monitored? Is there a set frequency or deadline? When will the monitoring take place or measurement take place? Who is responsible for doing that? You really have to go through the process of determining all of those things and have the documented information to show that those determinations have been made. The internal audit section of the standard identifies specific factors to be determined within the audit program and requires that the internal audit results be reported to relevant managers, workers and/or their representatives, and other interested parties that may be relevant. The management review section has some additional inputs and outputs or changes to the previous inputs and outputs that are required for the health and safety management system reviews to be performed by top management. So again, that top management term is used, and it's important to make sure you've identified who that top management is within your organization. Clause 10 covers improvement, and 10.1 requires the identification of opportunities for improvement. This relates to Clause 9. This relates to the call for proactivity. The opportunities for improvement are not always required by some of the other standards. In some cases, they've been removed, but the idea of opportunities for improvement is important to both proactivity and continual improvement. You are identifying areas where an incident hasn't occurred yet, a near miss hasn't occurred yet, but the system is weak, or a requirement is not being met, or a control, I shouldn't say that requirement's not being met, a control is not in place to prevent a requirement from not being met. Anywhere that you can identify the opportunity for improvement before it turns into an incident, an injury, something of that nature is really the idea of the proactivity. Regarding incidents, nonconformities, and corrective actions, Section 10.2 requires timely action be taken to address or correct incidents or nonconformities. So sometimes we see incidents or nonconformities go unaddressed for a long period of time, or the investigation is ongoing because other things have taken priority or taken precedence. This really requires timely action, not only to prevent similar incidents from happening in the interim, but also for the sake of the corrective action process or the incident investigation process to not take an extended period of time. Corrective actions must be reviewed for effectiveness. There's that effectiveness evaluation piece again, and have evidence, so documented information. You need to be able to prove that this process is in place, it's effective, by showing those outputs in some way, shape, or form. So not only that the corrective actions have been taken, you'd need to prove, but you also need to prove the evaluation of effectiveness has occurred. This section also requires the results of incident investigations or corrective actions as appropriate be reported to relevant workers and/or their representatives and relevant interested parties. So this won't necessarily be all the interested parties. This would be, again, as relevant. 10.3 covers continual improvement specifically. So the management system needs to improve its performance. We talked about this earlier, the emphasis of continual improvement being on the performance rather than the management system itself. Creating and maintaining a culture that supports the occupational health and safety management system, the participation of workers in implementing controls that drive those improvements, that can be really, really beneficial. Communicating results is important in terms of the continual improvement process as well. And we already mentioned the need throughout the standard to maintain documented information as evidence of any actions taken or improvements made specific to continual improvement. In ISO 45001, there is Annex A, which at the end of the document or the standard itself provides guidance on the use of the standard. And there's obviously a bibliography. So we're not going to go through either of those, but they are available at the end of the ISO 45001 standard. Excuse me. As I mentioned, there are some other related changes that coincide with the release of ISO 45001. I'm not going to go through these in great detail. Typically, these are meant for the registrar, the certification bodies, the program management, but I felt that a couple of the requirements were worth mentioning as they trickle down to our clients, to the organizations who are pursuing certification. There is a requirement to notify your registrar, your certification body like PJR, of significant changes in writing. So formally notify PJR's program management of significant changes in a very timely manner. It's not appropriate to wait until your next audit to let us know that you've moved or that you've added, you've significantly changed your processes, or you're adding to your scope, or I'm trying to think of some of the other changes that qualify as significant changes. So if that's not a term that's familiar to you, that's another one to get acquainted with. And remember to notify us in writing as soon as possible so that we can make the necessary changes. We might have to come in and audit those changes prior to your next audit, or it can impact the audit time. And you don't want to wait until the audit is already taking place and deal with all the extra costs of adding time to the audit, changing the travel arrangements. It can be quite costly, but also would be in violation of these mandatory document requirements. There are changes to the prescribed audit timetable specific to ISO 45001, calculated by risk level and employee count. These are prescribed by the mandatory documents above. These are not created by PJR, so you will see an increase in audit time associated with ISO 45001, and that is required, that is prescribed, that is not something coming from PJR's own changes. Going hand in hand with the top management accountability, if top management does not attend the closing meeting, which is arguably the most important part of the audit, a reasonable excuse for their absence needs to be provided, and the auditor will document that within their audit package. So that's something to keep in mind as you're planning your audits, as you're seeing that shift to a greater level of top management accountability. The certification body may conduct special audits in response to compliance issues, incidents, etc., and may even suspend or withdraw certification. That's not necessarily new. It's in the terms and conditions, but I did want to call that out for anyone who's not already aware of that potential. Legal compliance violations or gaps may prevent or impede initial certification for new clients. We'll need to look at objective evidence of how that is being handled to make an informed decision about the eligibility for certification. Overall, the changes in these documents, as well as the changes in ISO 45001, really raise the bar for performance expectations. So proactive, top management accountability, and improving the performance of the management system rather than just the management system itself. I know I'm running out of time here. I want to leave time for questions. So just very briefly, for anyone who is pursuing certification for the first time, the process would include a couple of key steps: establishing the documentation to meet the ISO 45001 standard requirements, conducting any training that's needed by standard and your system requirements, implementing those system requirements, including conducting an internal audit of the whole system, your compliance evaluation, whether or not you're meeting those legal and other requirements, and a full system review, your management review after the internal audit, so that those audit results can be included as an input to that review. You would need a contract with a certification body such as PJR, and then you would complete your stage 1 and stage 2 audits, which we'll talk about in a second, address any resulting nonconformities, and then you'd be issued a certificate as a result. So those 2 audits for that initial registration process or initial certification process include the stage 1, which is a documentation review, making sure the framework, that the framework of the system is in place to meet the requirements of the standard, and evaluate your readiness for stage 2. So the stage 2 audit would be a full system audit, all of the processes, all of the shifts, all of the requirements of the standard, whether your framework that we verified in stage 1 is effectively implemented and meeting the requirements of the standard. Your stage 2 audit could result in nonconformities, which would need to be resolved prior to the issuance of a certificate. Once the certificate is issued, it is good for 3 years, so you'll be on a 3-year cycle of 2 years worth of surveillance audits, which could be semi-annual or annual depending on the contract, and those represent partial system audits. They should be shorter than the stage 2. We don't necessarily need to cover all of the processes or shifts. It would be a sampling. And then on that 3rd year, the recertification audit is really identical to the stage 2 audit in that it covers all of the processes, all the shifts, and results in the issuance of another 3-year certificate. So the cycle starts all over from there. If you have any specific questions, we can talk offline about that as well. My contact information will be up at the end of the presentation. For health and safety standards, sometimes we see multi-site certifications where you have a headquarters location and several other locations doing the same exact activities. And there are pros and cons to that, which I've listed in case you're pursuing certification for the first time. Your salesperson can also help you with that. And we can talk offline to see what may be applicable to you. I also mentioned that OSAS 18001 and now ISO 45001 can be integrated with other standards. Sometimes we see them integrated with health, an environmental standard or a quality standard, and there can be audit time discounts associated with integrated audits. If we are not needing to review the same thing 2 times at 2 separate audits, we can discount the time as there would be a lot of overlap there. So you can review these slides offline as well if you're wondering if this is appropriate for your organization. If you have not already done so, please take a minute to type any questions you might have. And in the meantime, I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen. So again, my name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager with PJR. I also have our program manager, our EHS program manager, Stacy DeSantis, up on the screen here. Her email address, we can both be contacted by the main PJR number or via email. If you are a new client looking for a quote to pursue certification, you can contact our sales department and they can help you with that. And as I said, feel free to contact me with any questions about today's presentation or about questions that are very specific to your organization that you'd like to talk about offline. So let's take a look at the questions that we do have. Okay, there's a question about taking a screenshot. What I would recommend, since I'm not sure which slides you're looking for and we're running out of time here, as I mentioned, you can download the slides from today's presentation as well as a recording of today's presentation off PJR's website after the webinar is completed. Okay, the next question, if we are already 19,001 certified, Is the only real difference to incorporate safety for a small company, 12 people? Would this just be a short half-day to full-day add-on, or would an entire 2 to 3 day audit need to be done? So I don't have all of that information in front of me. I think it would be better to talk offline about how much time would be needed, or we could involve sales or scheduling to calculate that more effectively. But to answer your question about the difference between the standards, the difference between ISO 9001 and ISO 45001, yes, is focused on quality versus occupational health and safety, respectively. So if the health and safety aspect is something that is relevant or would be beneficial, we could certainly calculate what that audit time would look like to add that on to an existing certification that you already have, and go from there. ISO 45001 doesn't deal with the product requirements at all, like ISO 9001 does. It really, as I said, is focused on the occupational health and safety management. I hope that answers your question. And again, feel free to reach out to me offline or our sales department for a quote. There's a question about, for those migrating from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, do you need a stage 1 or stage 2 audit? So no, you would have your migration audit, which could take place during a surveillance or recertification audit. You would be migrating this year if you haven't already. 2020 would be the last year to migrate. The only way I can think of that you would need a stage 1 or stage 2 would be if you don't migrate before your OSAS 18001 certificate expires, which obviously we're trying to avoid by having you migrate before that deadline to prevent a lapse in certification. If there's a lapse in certification, I'm not sure exactly what that process looks like. It might vary depending on how much of a lapse there is, but that would hopefully be avoided by migrating before that deadline. That would be the plan. It's easier for us and it's easier for you. So take a look at when your 2020 audit is scheduled for. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact myself or your scheduler. Let's see. Thank you. Do we have any other questions this morning before we end today's webinar? I can hang out for another minute. Like I said, my contact information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me. Doesn't look like there are any other questions. So thank you so much for joining us today for the webinar on ISO 45001. If you have already migrated, I hope the webinar was helpful. If you are migrating in the near future, I hope the contents are helpful in preparing for that audit. Good luck on your migration, and feel free to reach out to me. Wait, we do have one more question maybe. Nope. Okay. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions as you prepare for your migration or your initial registration audit for ISO 45001 if you're a new client. So happy New Year. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.